What would you find if you drove deep into the hills of West Virginia, down a narrow road where the trees close in and the map itself seems to forget the way? And what if, at the end of that road, you found a house that the world was never meant to see? Tonight, we open the ledger on one of the strangest families ever brought before the camera, the Whitakers of Odd, West Virginia. For generations they lived in silence, hidden from history, their existence known only to neighbors who kept their distance. Then, in the early 2000s, a photographer knocked on their door, and the silence was broken not by words, but by the sound of barking. Years later, when the footage was finally released to the world, millions of people could not look away. What they saw was not a performance nor a legend, but a family living at the intersection of poverty, isolation, and whispered ancestry. Some called it exploitation, others called it exposure. But the truth of who the Whitakers are remains unsettled, caught between rumor and record. Before we begin, welcome to Gothic Ledger. Tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from, and what time it is for you right now, and if you are drawn to forgotten histories, unsettling mysteries, and the stories that institutions tried to leave behind, make sure to like this video and subscribe. Because what follows is not folklore nor fiction. It is a chronicle of a family that still lives in Odd, still walks the same narrow road, and still embodies a mystery that no lens has ever fully explained. In the hills of southern West Virginia lies a place with a name too fitting, Odd. It is not a town in the conventional sense, but an unincorporated settlement tucked within Raleigh County, along a narrow road where the forest leans inward and the creek cuts the land into silence. For most of its history, Odd did not appear on maps that mattered. It was known only to those who lived in its hollows, a cluster of homes that seemed less built than left behind. Coal once gave this county its shape. Mines cut through the mountains, carving out both livelihoods and dependence. When the seams thinned and the work slowed, poverty settled in like a permanent fog. Families that remained after the industry's decline learned to live within the shadow of absence of work, of opportunity, of notice from the wider world. Odd was a name on a signpost, a word spoken by postal clerks and little else. The geography reinforced the isolation. Narrow ridges and steep wooded slopes discouraged travelers. Houses stood at irregular distances, sometimes hidden behind thickets or perched above gullies. It was a land where silence was not an interruption, but the rule, broken only by the passing of a truck or the rush of water after heavy rains. For those within, the outside world often felt as distant as another century. Odd's anonymity endured through the 20th century. Census takers recorded numbers, but no story reached beyond the county lines. Even in Raleigh County, with its long history of strikes, disasters, and migration, Odd was a footnote. Few came in, and fewer still left with anything worth repeating. To most of West Virginia, it was a forgotten hollow, indistinguishable from dozens of others that dotted the Appalachian interior. This obscurity persisted until the early years of the 21st century. In 2004, a photographer named Mark Leiter first turned down Tommy Creek Road, approaching a modest home that would later become known to millions. The moment passed quietly at the time, marked only by suspicion and retreat. But the encounter signaled a change that Odd itself could not anticipate. For centuries, isolation had protected this valley. It had preserved its families, its rhythms, its secrecy. But in the new century, obscurity was no longer guaranteed. The internet had begun erasing borders of distance and anonymity. What could once remain buried in the hills was suddenly at risk of exposure to the entire world. Odd had always lived up to its name, a settlement too small to claim identity, too remote to invite intrusion. Yet this very quality of invisibility made what followed so disorienting. A place that had been silent, a family that had been left undisturbed, would soon stand at the center of one of the strangest spectacles of the digital age. But no one in Odd knew what would happen when a lens turned toward the house on Tommy Creek. The first approach was not welcomed, it was answered by barking. In 2004, long before the world knew the Whitakers by name, photographer Mark Leiter took a narrow turn onto Tommy Creek Road. The lane was unremarkable, winding through Raleigh County's Appalachian thickets, but it led to a home that had been spoken of in whispers by locals. Leiter had come in search of hidden America, documenting lives left outside the view of cities and highways. In Odd, he found not only isolation, but resistance. The house itself was small, weathered, and set back from the road. Its appearance betrayed nothing extraordinary. Siding worn by rain, a yard cluttered by objects too useful to discard, but too broken to serve. Yet something about its silence felt pronounced, as if the walls themselves withheld their story. Leiter approached with the intent of introduction, unaware that his footsteps would stir something far older than curiosity. From within, the first response was not a voice, nor a greeting. It was a sound closer to animal than human. Sharp barks, guttural noises that seemed less performed than instinctive. The noise surged against him like a wall, unmistakably defensive. He froze, caught between the impulse to explain himself and the realization that explanation was not wanted. The threshold marked not an entrance but a barrier. Suspicion hung in the air, heavier than the August heat. Windows reflected back nothing but glare. Movement inside suggested life just beyond reach, but no one emerged. Only the barking continued, layered with other indistinct sounds. Grunts, shouts muffled into something unreadable. In that moment, Leiter was not a visitor, but an intruder. The hollow had declared its boundary. He withdrew, unsettled but drawn. There was nothing to film, no words exchanged, no documentation secured. Yet the absence itself was striking. In a land where families often remain in private, this encounter was different, not mere shyness, but defense. It was as if language itself had collapsed at the threshold, replaced by signals of warning. The experience lingered long after he left Tommy Creek. Leiter would return years later, this time with a camera and persistence, eventually breaking through the silence that had first repelled him. But the memory of that first knock endured, a moment where Odd lived up to its name, and where a house revealed its strangeness not by opening, but by closing itself off. For the Whitakers, the intrusion was nothing unusual. Outsiders had occasionally passed, curious but unwelcomed. Their response was not for spectacle, but for survival. For generations, Odd had belonged to those who stayed, not those who came looking. To step onto that porch was to trespass into a space that owed nothing to the outside world. The world would later know their faces, their voices, or the absence of them. But in 2004, all that was known was the refusal. The barking, the unseen movements, the unspoken demand to leave. What lived behind those doors was not forgotten. It waited. When the footage was released, the world could not look away. In 2020, a video appeared on a channel known as Soft White Underbelly. Its title was stark, its subject unassuming: Inbred Family, the Whitakers. Within hours, it began to spread. Within days, it reached millions. What had once been a hollow hidden in the folds of Raleigh County was suddenly projected onto the screens of strangers in every corner of the world. The camera lingered on a family that had lived largely unseen. Faces filled the frame: Betty's stillness, Lorraine's cautious eyes, Ray's guttural sounds that unsettled even as they fascinated. Nothing about the setting was staged. The clutter of a yard, the dim interior, the rhythms of a household both ordinary and estranged. Yet it was precisely this unfiltered quality that struck viewers. They were watching not actors, not participants in a staged production, but people who had existed in anonymity until this sudden unveiling. The reaction was immediate and divided. Some watched with curiosity, remarking on the strangeness of what they saw. Others expressed shock, attributing to the family every rumor whispered about inbreeding and lineage collapse. A portion of viewers responded with empathy, urging compassion for those whose lives seemed marked by poverty and isolation. But whether in fascination, judgment, or pity, the response shared one thing in common: no one could look away. As the view count climbed into the millions, the Whitakers' image hardened into symbol. Their silence became spectacle, their gestures replayed endlessly across platforms. Clips were dissected in forums, analyzed by strangers who had never set foot in Raleigh County. Their home was no longer a secluded dwelling along Tommy Creek. It had become the stage for one of the internet's most viral case studies in human otherness. The anonymity that had sheltered the family for generations dissolved overnight. Odd, once invisible, became a place people sought on maps. The Whitakers, once known only to neighbours and passers-by, were now names spoken across continents. The hollow had been breached, not by trespassers at the door, but by the limitless reach of digital exposure. The video's impact cannot be measured solely by views. It altered perception of what Appalachia could represent, not just coal mines and decline, but hidden genealogies, secrets preserved in silence, lives shaped beyond the gaze of institutions. In a moment, the Whitakers were lifted from obscurity and placed into a narrative they did not control, a narrative written in the comments of strangers and in the collective imagination of a global audience. What began as a portrait became a phenomenon. Yet within the phenomenon lay distortion. The footage revealed presence but not context, gestures but not history. The family became an emblem of inbreeding, of poverty, of Appalachian isolation, labels applied by those outside, none of them complete. The world saw a family, but they did not see the whole truth. What the camera revealed was striking, but what it concealed was more important. The footage released in 2020 showed the Whitakers not through medical charts or genealogical diagrams, but through the simplest of observations: the way they sat, the way they moved, the sounds they made in place of words. In those frames, the family appeared not as subjects of analysis, but as presences fixed in their own routines. Ray became the most haunting figure for viewers. He did not speak in sentences, but in guttural barks and grunts, sounds that seemed less chosen than instinctive. His communication was unmistakably expressive, directed, purposeful, often accompanied by pointed gestures, but it resisted translation. To many he appeared both closed and open at once, unreachable by words, yet unguarded in sound. The camera lingered on him longer than on others, not because he explained himself, but because he could not. Beside him often sat Betty, a figure of stillness. Her presence in the frame was marked not by motion, but by the absence of it. She carried an air of resignation, as though years of being seen and unseen had settled into quiet endurance. When addressed by Laita's camera, her responses were measured, subdued, neither inviting nor rejecting. She became, in effect, the still anchor of the family's visual record. Lorraine appeared differently, more guarded, more conscious of the lens. Her eyes often moved quickly, scanning, cautious, revealing an awareness of intrusion. In her, the footage captured the tension of being made visible against one's will. Viewers noted the restraint in her manner, the way she seemed both present and withdrawn, giving fragments, but never a full picture. These three figures, Ray's sound, Betty's stillness, Lorraine's guarded gaze, formed the core of what the audience consumed. Yet in all of it, no explanation was offered. The footage recorded unsolved behavior, not cause. No medical names were spoken, no charts held up, no diagnoses declared. The world was left to watch, to interpret, and to speculate. The absence of labels was striking. The family was presented as they were, not as a case file. Their traits were not framed within genetics, psychology, or pathology, but left unclassified, ambiguous. It was this very silence that stirred the strongest reactions. Fascination, judgment, pity, outrage, all projected onto lives that had given no definition of themselves. The footage became a mirror in which viewers saw what they wanted to see. Some read disability, others inbreeding, others poverty alone. But none of these interpretations came from the family themselves. They were never asked to define what outsiders wished to name. Their condition remained theirs alone, unspoken, unresolved. The record thus became paradoxical, vivid in image yet void in explanation. The Whitakers were seen in extraordinary detail, yet their essence remained untouched, concealed by the very absence of words. Their lives were recorded, but their condition remained unwritten. Some say the tree had grown too close to itself. When the Whitakers' story spread across the internet in 2020, the most persistent explanation offered by outsiders was one of lineage. The claim repeated in tabloids and online discussions was that the parents had been cousins, sometimes specified as double first cousins, a union in which two branches of the same tree fold tightly together. It was this compression, they argued, that produced the traits the world now studied in the footage. But such statements remain only that, claims. No official genealogical record has been presented to confirm or deny them. Census registers in Raleigh County list numbers and surnames, but they do not illuminate private unions or unwritten bonds within remote hollows. Birth certificates are not easily accessed, and the family itself has offered no documentation. What circulates instead are whispers, framed as explanation, repeated until assumption hardens into myth. The phrase double first cousins carried its own unsettling resonance. In genealogical terms, it collapses distinction between uncle and cousin, nephew and sibling. The tree ceases to branch outward and begins to circle back, a loop rather than a spread. To many viewers, this became the convenient lens through which to interpret the Whitakers, a family marked by inward-bending branches sealed off from the outside by more than geography. Yet in the absence of proof, such interpretations reveal as much about outsiders as about the family itself. The hunger for explanation, why does Ray bark, why do Betty and Lorraine appear as they do, found satisfaction not in records, but in rumor. Isolation became equated with inbreeding, silence became evidence of collapsed ancestry. What was unverified was nevertheless consumed as truth, because it felt narratively complete. This is the danger of compressed ancestry as story. Once suggest, Ed. It requires little to sustain itself. It folds the mystery into a single phrase, reducing a family's complexity to a lineage formula. But without documents, without testimony, the claim remains only a shadow projected onto the Whitakers by those outside odd. It is important to note what remains unseen. No public record confirms cousin unions in the immediate generation. No certified genealogy exists to chart precisely how the family connects across branches. The compression may be real, or it may be overstated, magnified by fascination with the taboo. Between fact and speculation lies a gap, and it is in that gap the Whitakers have remained. For centuries, Appalachian communities have carried reputations of insularity, their genealogies viewed through a lens of suspicion. To attach the same narrative to the Whitakers fits within a pattern, one as much cultural as biological. In their case, it is the absence of evidence that fuels the myth, the silence of records that invites outsiders to draw the branches inward. The Whitaker tree exists. Its branches are real, but whether they bend inward and how far remains a question unanswered. The branches of the Whitaker tree bend inward, but how far no one can say. In Odd, a voice was heard that was not words. Among the Whitakers, Ray became the figure most often remembered. The footage of him, eyes darting, body shifting, throat releasing sharp barks and guttural sounds, struck viewers more deeply than anything spoken aloud. Where Betty responded with stillness and Lorraine with guarded glances, Ray communicated in a manner wholly his own. He did not use sentences, he did not form phrases, yet his presence carried an unmistakable weight. On camera, Ray's sound seemed both warning and expression. A bark, sudden and harsh, often marked the arrival of a visitor or the attention of the lens. Shorter grunts accompanied gestures, a pointed finger, a quick glance, a shuffle in the dirt. Though outside ears could not interpret them as language, within the family they appeared understood. His siblings reacted without confusion, as if his barks were as clear as words long practiced. For viewers around the world, this became haunting. Millions watched, replaying the moments where Ray seemed to collapse the distinction between man and animal. To some, it was disturbing. To others, it was evidence of genetic collapse. To many, it became the single image that defined the family. Yet for the family itself, Ray was not spectacle. He was kin. His sounds were not aberrations, but the normal vocabulary of their daily lives. The fascination with Ray reveals less about him than about the gaze that watched him. Silence unsettles, particularly when it comes from one expected to speak. In his absence of words, viewers projected meanings, tragedy, otherness, mystery. But the footage itself offered no explanation. There were no diagnoses, no scientific accounts, no authoritative interpretation. There was only Ray, sounding in his own register, and the world listening without comprehension. This lack of comprehension amplified the aura around him. Ray's sealed. Communication became the shorthand by which people described the Whitakers, the one who barked. In comments and discussions, his sounds were repeated as proof of all that was whispered about the family's ancestry. But what such repetitions overlooked was that Ray was never silent. He was speaking in a language of his own, simply one not understood by outsiders. In an archival sense, his presence demonstrates how communication itself can become a boundary. Words allow entry, allow outsiders to participate. Sound without words resists intrusion. In this way, Ray became both the most visible and the most unreachable of the Whitakers. The camera captured him more vividly than anyone else, yet revealed less. His language closed as much as it opened. It is fitting, then, that Ray became the enduring symbol of the family online, not because he explained them, but because he did not. His voice, if it can be called that, embodied the tension between exposure and concealment that defined the Whitakers' story. The world heard him, yet could not understand him. For some, his silence spoke louder than speech. A trip to Walmart became an international spectacle. When Mark Leiter returned to Odd after the first viral release, his camera did not seek only interviews or portraits. It followed the Whitakers into their daily routines, preparing meals, buying groceries, trimming hair. Activities that elsewhere would pass without remark became, through the frame, events studied and replayed by millions. The ordinary, once invisible, was transformed into something uncanny. In one sequence, the family sat together at breakfast. Plates were filled, cups were lifted, and the simple rhythm of eating unfolded in silence. Yet under the lens, every gesture took on weight. Viewers noted the stillness, the pauses, the absence of words at the table. A meal that should have been unremarkable became commentary, evidence of strangeness, proof of rumor, or for some, a portrait of endurance. What in most homes would pass unnoticed was consumed globally as content. Another video followed a trip to Walmart. The aisles of a chain store, fluorescent lit and ordinary, became the stage for a collision of worlds. Cameras captured glances, items lifted from shelves, small exchanges that seemed trivial. Yet the audience, primed by earlier footage, saw more than shopping. They saw the family in public, navigating spaces built for a world from which they had long been distant. To viewers, the sight was both familiar and alien, the most routine of errands made haunting through context. Even grooming, a haircut, a shave, was recorded and shared. These simple acts, private in most households, became public theatre. The sound of scissors, the sweep of clippers, the reveal of a face beneath overgrowth, all were amplified by the lens. Strangers commented, analyzed, speculated, as though the removal of hair could reveal more than appearance, could uncover the mystery beneath. The uncanny effect arose not from what the family did, but from the gaze placed upon them. Breakfast, shopping, grooming, none of these acts were extraordinary in themselves. But once framed within the narrative of isolation and whispered ancestry, they became loaded. The ordinary was read as symptom, the mundane interpreted as evidence. Silence at breakfast became pathology. Awkwardness in a store became proof of disconnection. In this way, viewers turned daily life into spectacle. Archival detachment shows how rituals of survival, meals, supplies, maintenance, can be stripped of their neutrality when exposed to outside eyes. What sustains life was here consumed as entertainment. The family did not alter their routines. The routines themselves were transformed by their sudden status as content. This transformation raises a larger question about the act of watching. When the world peers into the rituals of those once hidden, what is revealed? Do we learn about the family or about ourselves, our fascination with otherness, our hunger for the uncanny within the mundane? For the Whitakers, life continued as before. Breakfast was eaten, groceries were purchased, hair was trimmed. But for millions of strangers, these moments became charged with meaning, proof of something greater than routine. Nothing about daily bread should unsettle, yet it did. Charity began to flow, but so did expectation. As the Whitakers' story spread, the lens brought more than visibility. It brought gifts, parcels of clothing, boxes of food, envelopes of money arrived through the same channels that had once carried only rumor. A GoFundMe account was established, drawing contributions from strangers who had never set foot in West Virginia, but felt compelled to intervene. What began as fascination turned into support, a transfer of resources across distance. Mark Leiter, the photographer who had first brought their lives into view, stated publicly that every cent, minus taxes and fees, was delivered directly to the family. He became the conduit between audience and subject, recording their lives, then relaying the generosity that attention generated. In his telling, the arrangement was simple. The world watched, the world gave, and he carried those gifts to Odd. Yet even within this chain, questions arose. Viewers debated whether charity served the family or the filmmaker. Some suspected exploitation. Others defended it as lifeline. Each donation carried not just money, but judgment. Who was giving, why they were giving, and what would be done with the gift. The Whitakers became recipients of an economy not built on wages or work, but on the gaze of millions and the empathy or curiosity of strangers. The family accepted the gifts without explanation. To them, the parcels and payments were additions to survival, filling gaps left by poverty. Food was eaten, clothing worn, money spent. But once acceptance was shown on camera, expectation followed. The internet, having given, demanded proof of gratitude, evidence of improvement, or signs that generosity had changed circumstances. What had been offered freely became measured, tallied like an account book with no final balance. This dynamic transformed the Whitakers' relationship to the outside world. Where once they had existed unseen, now they were sustained partly by visibility itself. The act of being recorded became linked to the flow of charity. With each new video, more donations appeared. With each new donation, more questions circulated. Support became obligation, and obligation became burden. Archival reflection shows the fragile nature of such arrangements. Unlike wages, charity is unstable, contingent on continued interest. It carries with it not only generosity, but scrutiny. A GoFundMe page is as much performance as it is need. Its success relies on the persistence of attention. For the Whitakers, attention was both resource and risk, the very thing that could sustain them, and the very thing that could undo them. No ledger can measure the exchange exactly. The family received clothing, food, and money. The world received content, mystery, and the satisfaction of participation. The balance sheet is incomplete, for it cannot calculate the weight of expectation or the cost of being known. Charity saved, but it also bound. It created obligations where once there had been none. Whether the camera rescued the Whitakers or trapped them within an endless cycle of giving and watching remains unanswered. No one could say whether the camera had rescued them or trapped them. In December 2023, the house itself caught flame. The Whitakers' home, already a structure of fragility, faced its most destructive trial when fire swept through. Accounts described it as sudden, consuming the mobile home that had sheltered them through years of exposure and intrusion. For a family that had withstood the weight of rumor, speculation, and the ceaseless gaze of millions, this was a calamity of another order, physical, undeniable, and final in its destruction. The dwelling was never built for permanence. Mobile homes, thin-walled and lightly framed, are vulnerable to heat and spark. When fire began, it spread with speed. The damage was swift, displacing the family and scattering what possessions had been gathered through years of both poverty and charity. The objects sent by strangers, clothing, appliances, small comforts, were reduced to ash, erasing the ledger of gifts that had accumulated since their first appearance online. News of the fire travelled outward not through official reports, but through the same lens that had first made the Whitakers known. Video of the aftermath showed the scorched shell, the family now without shelter. The audience that had watched their meals and errands was once again drawn in, this time to witness loss. Donations followed quickly. Another fundraiser was established, another call for help sent out across the same networks that had once broadcast fascination. The public reaction split along familiar lines. Some offered sympathy, remarking that no family, regardless of circumstance, should face such devastation. Others questioned the cycle, suspecting performance, doubting need, or viewing the calamity as another stage in a narrative that had blurred the line between reality and spectacle. The blaze, in effect, reignited not only the family's survival crisis, but the debate over what it meant for strangers to watch, to give, and to judge. For the Whitakers themselves, displacement was immediate and tangible. A home was gone, a routine shattered. Fire stripped away privacy in a way cameras never could. It removed walls, exposed absence, left them literally without cover. Survival, once tied to charity and ritual, now depended on reconstruction. Yet the question remained whether rebuilding would restore stability, or whether the act of rebuilding would only invite further scrutiny. Archival reflection records the fire as a turning point, not for its flames, but for its aftermath. In Odd, houses burn and are rebuilt, life resumes. But here, each disaster became part of a narrative already shared with the world. The fire did not remain a local misfortune. It became another chapter in a story that no longer belonged solely to those living it. The Whitakers' anonymity had long since been consumed. The fire consumed what remained of their physical shelter. What it did not consume was the enduring mystery that had made the family a subject of endless speculation. The fire burned the walls, but it did not burn the questions. A death was announced, then doubted. In March 2024, a new video appeared under the soft white underbelly banner. Its title was unequivocal: The Death of Larry Whittaker. Viewers, already conditioned to witness the family's hardships as a form of unfolding chronicle, clicked to find what they assumed would be the final word on one of Odd's most visible figures. The presentation carried a tone of certainty. Larry, they were told, was gone. Reactions poured in swiftly. Comment sections filled with condolences, speculation about causes, and reflections on what Larry had represented in the series of films. For some, his death was framed as the inevitable outcome of poverty, isolation, and hardship. For others, it was a reminder that the Whittaker story was not merely content. It was a record of lives vulnerable to the same end as any other. Yet soon after, the certainty unraveled. New footage emerged in which Larry appeared alive, seated, moving, his presence undeniable. Viewers who had mourned now felt betrayed. Confusion hardened into accusation. Had his death been fabricated, exaggerated, or miscommunicated? Was this deception, error, or a symptom of a larger problem, the blurring of truth and spectacle in the portrayal of the Whittakers? The backlash was immediate and fierce. Online forums dissected the contradiction, pointing to inconsistencies in narration, editing, and communication between filmmaker and family. Apology statements followed, attempting to clarify misunderstandings. But clarification did little to restore trust. The damage had been done. Once death itself was questioned, every other detail of the Whittaker story became suspect in the eyes of many. For decades, Odd had existed as a place where silence shielded truth from outsiders. Now, even when truth was spoken or claimed, it no longer carried certainty. Larry's reported death became emblematic of the instability of the entire narrative. If death could be misrecorded, what else in the story was unreliable? How much of what viewers consumed was reality, and how much was a product of framing, editing, or assumption? Archival reflection captures this moment as a fracture. The earlier chapters of the Whittakers' exposure had been marked by mystery, but also by acceptance of what was shown. After Larry's supposed death, acceptance gave way to suspicion. Audiences no longer received the footage passively. They interrogated it, doubted it, demanded proof. The gaze shifted from fascination with the family to distrust of those who mediated their image. For the Whittakers themselves, the contradiction may have meant little beyond confusion over what was said in their name. Yet for the outside world, it symbolized a collapse of certainty. The line between documentation and spectacle blurred beyond recognition. In that collapse, the Whittakers became not just a family under scrutiny, but a mirror for the unreliability of the stories told about them. In Odd, even death seemed uncertain. The camera was not the only visitor. As the Whittakers' story spread, Odd itself became a point of destination. Strangers who had first encountered the family through the glow of screens began to make the journey in person. The narrow road along Tommy Creek, once travelled only by locals and delivery trucks, saw unfamiliar cars idling at its bends. Outsiders, driven by curiosity or morbid fascination, sought to see for themselves what the lens had already exposed. Some came under the guise of kindness, carrying food or small gifts. Others arrived uninvited, stepping into the yard without permission, peering through windows, shouting questions in hopes of receiving a response. The family, already burdened by the gaze of millions online, now faced intrusion at their very door. Their silence, once private, became a public attraction. The community of Odd felt the strain. Neighbors watched as outsiders trespassed, using backroads as paths to pilgrimage. Privacy, already fragile in small Appalachian hollows, collapsed under the weight of attention. Reports circulated of cars pulling up at night, of individuals knocking on doors not their own, of questions asked that no one wished to answer. Odd, long forgotten, had been turned into a spectacle. The paradox deepened. The very thing that had first drawn the world to the Whitakers, their remoteness, their obscurity, was now eroded by visitors. What had once been mythic in its distance was made mundane through intrusion. But in the process, the myth did not weaken. It grew. Each visitor carried away their own story, their own fragment of what they thought they had seen. The legend multiplied, no longer confined to footage, but reinforced by first-hand encounters, often exaggerated in the retelling. For the family, intrusion meant more than inconvenience. It reinforced the sense that they no longer owned their own lives. What was mass contained within the home, and the hollow was now treated as property of the public. Every appearance, every gesture, every sound was claimed, analyzed, and shared beyond their control. The Whitakers could neither escape the gaze of the camera nor the footsteps of those who arrived uninvited. Archival reflection records this as the point where visibility turned invasive. Viral fame is rarely confined to the digital sphere. It spills into geography, reshaping landscapes into sites of spectacle. For Odd, the intrusion meant the loss of its final barrier, the protective silence of being overlooked. What had preserved the Whitakers for so long was gone, replaced by the endless arrival of the curious. The trespassers did not find what they were looking for. They left with fragments, impressions, glances, pieces that confirmed the mystery without resolving it. In this way, each intrusion deepened the very uncertainty that drew them in the first place. The family remained unknowable, the hollow remained strange, and Odd itself grew only more unsettled. Some travelled to Odd searching for answers, others left with only more questions. The family's mystery cannot be told without the land itself. Odd lies within Raleigh County, a place shaped first by geology, then by industry, and finally by its absence. Beneath the ridges and valleys ran seams of coal, black veins that once promised livelihood to generations. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, towns rose and swelled around mines, their populations tethered to the rhythm of extraction. Entire communities lived according to the demands of the coal companies, their fortunes dependent on what could be pulled from beneath the earth. But the same seams that gave life also carried decline. By the late 20th century, coal's centrality had weakened. Mines closed, jobs vanished, and the structures of dependency collapsed into vacancy. Where there had once been the steady noise of work, silence grew. Families left for cities, drawn to whatever promise factory towns or distant suburbs could offer. Those who remained faced dwindling opportunities, trapped in valleys whose economies had evaporated. Odd was not immune. Though too small to be known outside Raleigh County, its fate mirrored the larger arc. Houses stood weathered, half-renovated, sometimes abandoned. Land once cleared for work grew back into thickets. Roads narrowed and cracked, untravelled except by locals. The name, Odd, seemed to reflect not only a place but a condition, a survival on the margins of recognition. Appalachia itself has long been marked by narratives of seclusion. Outsiders spoke of hollows, places where isolation bred difference. Writers described the mountains as both fortress and prison, keeping communities enclosed within their own customs. Over generations, such portrayals hardened into cultural myths. The idea that Appalachia was not merely rural, but strange, not merely poor, but insular. Whether true or distorted, these myths shaped the lens through which the world viewed places like Odd. It is from this soil that the Whitakers' story emerged. Their lives, captured in viral footage, did not exist apart from Raleigh County's history, but within it. Poverty, isolation, and the absence of industry were not theirs alone. They were the inheritance of the land itself. To interpret their story without acknowledging the decline around them would be to misplace cause and context. Archival reflection makes clear that Odd was already forgotten before the Whitakers were remembered. Its silence was not personal, but collective. The residue of a region once central to national industry, then discarded. The house on Tommy Creek was one of many dwellings left on the periphery of progress. What distinguished it was not its condition, but the fact that a camera finally turned its way. The family's mystery, then, belongs not only to them, but to Appalachia as a whole. It is the mystery of what remains after decline, what forms of life persist in valleys that no longer carry the sound of work. The Whitakers became emblematic not just of lineage, but of land, its silence, its persistence, its refusal to disappear. The hills kept secrets long before the Whitakers, and they still do. In this story, what is missing matters as much as what is seen. The Whitakers of Odd have been spoken of more than they have been documented. Their lives exist in footage and in fragments of conversation, yet their paper trail remains elusive. Census lists for Raleigh County record names, ages and households, but they do not chart the inner logic of unions or the conditions behind closed doors. Marriage certificates are scarce, birth records difficult to trace, and no genealogical archive confirms what has been claimed most loudly, that their parents were cousins or even double first cousins. What fills the gaps instead is rumor. Online commentary repeats the phrase inbred family with certainty, though no official proof has surfaced to validate it. Tabloid reports amplify the claim, but provide no documentary evidence. The repetition of rumor has become its own record, a substitute ledger that carries the weight of truth without ever having been written. Medical confirmation is equally absent. Viewers project diagnoses, pointing to gestures, sounds and silences as if they were symptoms to be catalogued. Yet no doctor's report has been made public, no medical file attached to their names. The camera shows bodies, but it does not show charts. The absence of such records leaves a vacuum, one that outsiders rush to fill with assumption. This absence itself is telling. Appalachia is filled with families whose histories are fractured in documentation. Poverty, isolation, and mistrust of institutions often meant that births were unrecorded, marriages informal, deaths marked only by a cross in the soil. The Whitakers are not alone in this. They exist within a regional pattern where silence in the archives is as common as ink. Yet when their story became global, the expectation of proof clashed with the reality of omission. What results is a tension between what the world demands to know and what the records will yield. Every missing certificate becomes evidence, every absent name interpreted as concealment. The silence of official archives becomes louder than any document, feeding the perception of secrecy. In this sense, absence operates as presence. The missing itself becomes part of the narrative. Archival reflection must therefore treat omission with care. What we do not have cannot be replaced by conjecture. To state as fact what remains undocumented is to shift from record to invention. The responsible task is to note the gap, to mark it as silence, and to acknowledge that silence as meaningful. The Whitakers' mystery rests as much in what has not been written as in what has been shown. Their genealogy is unproven, their diagnoses unconfirmed. They remain figures of speculation rather than of record. This is not because they have no history, but because their history has not been preserved in the ledgers outsiders trust. The ledger is blank, but the silence feels written. Who owns a story once the world is watching? The Whitakers' sudden visibility did not only raise questions of genealogy and poverty, it raised questions of ethics. From the moment millions encountered the family through soft white underbelly, critics began to ask whether the footage constituted documentation or exploitation. The debate widened beyond Odd, joining a larger discourse about poverty, disability, and the boundaries of voyeurism in digital media. Some saw the films as an act of witnessing, an unflinching record of lives rarely acknowledged. Donations flowed, aid arrived, and voices argued that exposure had provided the family with resources they might otherwise never have received. For this camp, the camera was a form of intervention, converting global fascination into tangible support. Others, however, called it exploitation. They labeled the series poverty porn, arguing that it transformed suffering into spectacle and profit. Viewers pointed to the imbalance. The filmmaker gained views, revenue, and notoriety, while the family remained in fragile circumstances. To these critics, the Whitakers were not participants, but subjects, their image circulating without their informed consent to the implications of global scrutiny. Vox documented this debate, noting the complexities of the arrangement. Leiter himself responded by insisting that the Whitakers received every cent raised through fundraising campaigns, aside from taxes and platform fees. He presented himself not as profiteer, but as intermediary, one who merely carried resources from the audience to the family. Yet the defense did not end the discussion, for the critique was not about money alone. It was about power. The imbalance of power was stark. On one side stood the global audience, numbering in millions, armed with commentary and speculation. On another stood the filmmaker, shaping the narrative through editing, titling, and choice of frame. And at the center were the Whitakers themselves, whose voices were largely absent, whose story was told primarily through others. The very traits that made them compelling to outsiders, their silence, their seclusion, their difference, were the same traits that left them unable to control how they were seen. This imbalance is the core of the ethical ledger. Who gains when private suffering becomes public content? Who loses when anonymity is stripped away? The ledger can be tallied in numbers: dollars raised, views counted, subscribers gained, but it cannot easily account for dignity, for intrusion, for the permanence of images uploaded to servers that will outlive the family themselves. Archival reflection leaves the ledger open. It notes the arguments in defense, the criticisms against, and the impossibility of resolution. For some, the record is evidence of generosity, for others, of exploitation. In truth, it is both. A paradox in which aid and intrusion are inseparable, where rescue and violation occur in the same gesture. The question of who profits is answered, but who pays remains unknown. Odd remains. So does the family. But so do the questions. When the cameras leave, the hollow does not change. The trees still lean over Tommy Creek. The house, rebuilt and repaired after flame, still shelters those within. The Whitakers wake, eat, walk, and live, as they always have. Yet around them now exists a shadow, larger than their own lives. The story told in millions of views, repeated across platforms, analyzed by strangers who will never step into Raleigh County. The family persists in survival, though what that survival means is left to outsiders to interpret. Some view them as victims of circumstance, others as relics of lineage collapse, still others as symbols of rural endurance. None of these interpretations are complete. What is clear is only this: the Whitakers remain. Odd, too, persists in its obscurity. Despite its global name recognition, it is still a settlement bypassed by maps and forgotten by the state. The road remains narrow, the houses scattered, the silence intact. For locals, life continues much as it did before 2020. For the world beyond, Odd exists primarily as a screen image, a location synonymous not with geography, but with mystery. What lingers is ambiguity. The videos provided visibility, but not comprehension. The genealogical questions remain unanswered, the medical explanations absent, the family's inner life left to silence. Viewers can replay the footage endlessly, but what they find is repetition, not resolution. Each new viewing only deepens the sense of something withheld. In this way, myth has outpaced fact. The Whitakers are no longer only a family in a hollow. They are an emblem carried into conversations about Appalachia, poverty, inbreeding, exploitation, and voyeurism. Their image has become a cultural artifact, distorted, debated, and endlessly circulated. Yet the family itself remains as it was, seated in their yard, walking their road, navigating a life the outside world will never fully enter. Archival reflection concludes not with resolution but with suspension. The Whitakers have not vanished. Odd has not disappeared. What persists is the uneasy coexistence of survival and speculation. Their truth is neither fully revealed nor erased. It exists in the liminal space between what the camera showed and what it could not capture. The story does not end with an answer. It ends with a presence. The hills still hold their silence, the family still inhabits their home, and the mystery still unsettles those who encounter it. To speak of them in the past tense would be false. To claim understanding would be presumptuous. The record is incomplete, and it is likely to remain so. Odd did not vanish when the cameras left. It simply grew stranger in their absence.